Colorado Territory, 1874. The morning sun had not yet broken over the frost-glazed tops of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains when Susanna Zeller stepped onto her porch and saw the note nailed to the fence post. Wind bit through her shawl. The yard was still, save for the chickens rustling in their coop and the horses behind the barn stomping against cold earth. Her boots crunched over frozen dirt as she approached the paper, her breath catching before her fingers even touched it. She already knew Jacob was gone. The words were short, no goodbye, no explanation, just, couldn't do it anymore. Tell the kids I'm sorry. Susanna stared at the handwriting until her eyes burned. Her hand trembled as she tore the note down and stuffed it into her apron pocket. She turned toward the house behind her, weather-beaten but solid, built with their hands, their sweat. Inside, her two children were still sleeping. She pressed a hand against her belly to keep it from twisting. She did not cry, not when she lit the fire, not when she stirred oats for breakfast. Not even when her 6-year-old daughter, Daisy, came padding into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, and asked where Pa had gone. He left, Susanna said, kneeling down to brush hair from Daisy's face. But we're going to be all right. I promise. By the time she got both kids dressed and fed, the sun had climbed higher, melting frost off the barn roof. She was fixing the latch on the chicken coop when she heard the crunch of boots in snow behind her. She turned, squinting against the light. Micah Ashford stood a few paces away, hat in hand. He lived on the neighboring homestead 300 yards west, just past the cottonwoods. He had helped Jacob fix the roof once, back when things had still felt like a future. A quiet man kept mostly to himself. 30, maybe 32. Broad-shouldered, dark hair, eyes steady as creek stone. You all right? He asked. Susanna rose to her feet, brushing straw off her skirt. I'm fine. Micah looked at her a long moment, then glanced toward the house. Jacob gone, she hesitated, then nodded once. Left in the night, he nodded too, as if he had expected it but hoped to be wrong. I saw his wagon heading south just before dawn. Susanna's throat tightened. He took the wagon, Micah's brow furrowed. Left you nothing? Just a note. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked like he wanted to say more but held it back. You got water? He asked. Some, enough for now. I'll bring more from my well this afternoon, and wood. Storm's coming tonight. She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already turning to leave. He paused after a few steps. Looked back at her. I'll stay close for a while. Keep watch at night. No one should be out here alone. I'm not alone, she said quietly. I have the children. Micah met her eyes. That's why I'll stay close. He tipped his hat, then walked off, boots firm and sure against the frozen ground. That night, Susanna lay awake long after the children had fallen asleep in the loft upstairs. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the shutters. She rose and wrapped herself in Jacob's old coat. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and sweat. She stepped outside and looked toward the tree line. A small lantern glowed in the dark. Micah had set up camp near the edge of her property, just where the cottonwoods began. She could see the flicker of firelight, the shape of him sitting beside it. He had meant it. He was guarding her home. Something in her chest pulled tight. She turned back inside, shut the door, and leaned against it, letting the warmth of the fire behind her soak into her bones. The next morning, Micah brought water and a stack of firewood. He did not speak much, just nodded when she thanked him. He helped mend the barn door, fixed the broken hinge on the chicken coop, and left without waiting for more. The third day, he stayed longer. Daisy followed him around the yard, peppering him with questions. Do you have a dog? No, not anymore. Why not? Old one died. Never got a new one, she blinked up at him. Mama says things die when they're too tired to try anymore. Micah gave her a somber look. Maybe, but sometimes they just stop hurting. Susanna listened from the porch, her heart aching. That night she brought him a bowl of stew. He took it gently, his hands brushing hers. You do not have to do this, she said. I know. Why are you? Micah glanced toward the house where the children's laughter drifted through the window. You should not have to keep watch alone. She looked at him a long time. Then nodded once and turned to go. Susanna, he said, stopping her. She turned back. I will stay as long as you need. Her voice came softer than she meant it. I do not know how long that will be. He gave a small nod. Then I will stay until you do. Days passed, then a week. Micah came every morning, worked beside her through snow and wind. He brought extra flour, mended the chicken wire, patched the roof above the children's room. He never asked for anything, never overstepped. But he was there, steady as the mountains behind them. One night she found him asleep beside the fire near the tree line, a rifle across his lap. She laid a blanket over his shoulders and stood there a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. She had not realized how empty the house had felt until now. The next morning he came late. She was hauling a bucket of water from the well when he appeared, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. "You all right?" she asked. Had to chase off a drifter. He was snooping too close last night. Her stomach turned. "Did he get near the house?" "No, I saw him early." "Send him off." She stepped closer, reached out to touch the scratch on his cheek. "You could have been hurt." Micah's eyes softened. "I have been hurt before. I will survive it again." She looked at him, her hand still resting against his face. "You do not have to keep doing this. You have your own land." "I do not care about my land," he said quietly. "I care about you." The words hung there between them, raw and real. Susanna's breath caught. "I do not know what comes next," she said. "I am not asking for anything right now," he said. "Just let me keep showing up." Her hand slipped from his face to his chest. He covered it with his own, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. A week after the last of the snow fell, the ground began to soften. Winter was loosening its grip, but it left behind deep ruts in the pasture and a sag in the porch roof where the weight of ice had lingered too long. Susanna stood barefoot in the kitchen, warming her feet near the stove while the children played with wooden blocks on the floor. The smell of wet earth drifted in through the open back door. Micah arrived just after midday, carrying a strip of burlap wrapped around something heavy. He set it on the table without a word and unwrapped it to reveal 4 curved iron hinges and a folding drawknife, the blade recently honed. "I had these spare," he said. "Figured you might need them for the gate and the woodpile." Susanna brushed flour from her hands and examined them. "You sharpened this yourself," he nodded, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Steel this good shouldn't sit idle." She studied the tool, then looked at him. "You're quiet today." Micah glanced toward the window where sunlight slanted across the fields. "My brother sent word. He passed through Trinidad last week, headed east. Said Ma's taken sick." "Is she expected to recover?" He lifted one shoulder. "Hard to say. She's got years on her, more than most get." Susanna hesitated. "Do you need to go to her?" He looked at her then, long and steady. "She raised me to finish what I start." They stood in silence, broken only by the soft clatter of wood blocks on the floor. Then Micah stepped back, reaching for the burlap. "I'll start on the fence, the south line's beginning to lean." She followed him out, wiping her hands on her apron. The wind had shifted, warmer now, carrying the promise of grass and the low hum of bees that hadn't yet returned. At the fence line, Micah crouched, testing the posts with both hands. "Did you know Jacob before he married me?" she asked suddenly. Micah didn't look up. "I knew of him." "Met him twice before you came west." "What did you think of him?" He took longer than necessary to answer, adjusting the post. "He struck me as a man who'd never learned to sit still." Susanna watched his face, the careful way he avoided judgment. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He stood, dusting his hands. "No, I came here knowing it'd be hard. Figured if I stayed long enough, it might start to feel like mine." She leaned against the fence. "You don't talk about your life before this." Micah turned toward her, sun catching the edge of his jaw. "Left Tennessee after the war, had nothing but an army blanket and a mule that died before I reached Kansas. I worked rail lines, freight yards, anything that paid enough to keep me fed. Came here because I wanted quiet, and because no one here knew me." She waited, but he didn't offer more. "Why not want to be known?" she asked. He picked up the drawknife and tested its edge against his thumb. "Some things feel lighter when they stay buried." Susanna didn't press. Instead, she walked to the barn and returned with a bundle of kindling, setting it down beside the porch. He joined her there, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe. "Daisy asked if you'd teach her to ride," she said. Micah smiled faintly. "She's small for the saddle still. She said you made her feel brave." He looked toward the hills. "I don't want to disappoint her." She doesn't expect anything from you. She just likes when you're here." He shifted, the wood creaking under his weight. "And you?" Susanna met his gaze. There was no rush to her voice, no hesitation. "I like when you're here too." He didn't answer, but his fingers brushed hers as they both reached for the same piece of wood. She didn't pull away. That evening, after the children were asleep, Susanna stepped out into the yard. The air was warmer than it had been in weeks, the kind that made you believe in growing things again. Micah sat near the edge of the pasture, oiling the stock of his rifle by lantern light. She walked to him without speaking and sat beside him on the low stump he used for a stool. The lantern cast a soft circle around them, pushing the darkness back just far enough to feel safe. "Do you miss the noise?" she asked. He looked at her, puzzled. "Of people, towns, places where you can disappear." Micah shook his head. "I spent enough time being invisible. I'd rather be seen now, even if it's only by a few." Susanna folded her hands in her lap. The lantern flickered in the wind. "You're not invisible here," she said. He set the rifle aside, slow and deliberate. "Neither are you." The quiet stretched between them, but it didn't feel empty. "I ain't ever been much good with words," Micah said, "but I want to be here not just for your safety, for you." She reached out, her fingers closing over his. His hand was rough, worn down by years of labor, but warm and steady beneath hers. "I don't need promises," she said. "But I won't be someone you wait out." Micah's voice was low. "You won't be." The moon cleared the treetops, casting silver across the pasture. Somewhere in the stillness, a coyote howled far off. The lantern's flame danced, catching the curve of her cheek as she leaned against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The first signs of spring arrived with a hush green shoots pushing through thawed earth, the creek behind the pasture running faster with meltwater, and the hush of geese overhead tracing their path north. Susanna raked last year's leaves from the garden rows while Daisy and Ellie dug their small hands into the soil, pretending to search for treasure. The air still held a tight chill in the mornings, but by midday, the sun pressed warm against her back. Micah had started coming earlier, sometimes before the rooster called. She found him that morning smoothing the edge of plank with the drawknife, his sleeves rolled and sawdust clinging to his forearms. He was building a shed along the far side of her barn, close enough for her to see from the kitchen window. "You're using more cedar than pine," she noted, setting down a basket of dry linens. "Cedar holds through the wet season," he said. "Won't rot as quick." She ran her hand along the cut boards. "You're thinking long term." Micah leaned back on his heels. "I don't know how to build halfway." Later that afternoon, after the children had gone quiet with their napping, she brought him a mug of chicory. He took it, nodding his thanks, and sat on the edge of the low foundation stones he'd laid that morning. "Did you plan for this?" she asked. "What part?" "This life, homesteading, solitude, the long winters." Micah's gaze traveled over the fence line. "I planned to outlive the war. That was as far as I got. Everything after was borrowed time." Susanna sat beside him, drawing her knees up under her skirt. "Borrowed from who?" He tilted his head. "From the men who didn't make it back." She watched his fingers tighten around the mug. "I didn't know that part of you," she said. "You weren't supposed to." "Why?" Micah exhaled slowly. "Because I didn't want you to look at me and see blood." She was quiet for a while, listening to the wind comb through the grass. "You're not the only one with a past, Micah. I know that. No, I mean there were days when I wanted to leave first, but I stayed, not for Jacob, for the children, for the land. I thought if I stayed long enough, maybe something good would grow." Micah turned to her. "Has it?" She nodded. "Yes." In the days that followed, the shed took shape. He framed the roof with care, every joint exact, every nail straight. Susanna helped where she could, holding boards, fetching tools, steadying the ladder while he worked high above. The two of them moved without needing to speak much. There was a rhythm now, built over weeks, that made the quiet feel full instead of empty. One evening after supper, she found Micah at the edge of the garden, holding a folded piece of paper. "Letter from your brother?" she asked. He shook his head. "From a man I knew in Missouri. He's asking if I'd consider buying his blacksmith shop. Said he can't keep up with it." Susanna's breath caught. "Would you go?" Micah didn't answer right away. "I thought about it once, before everything changed." She stepped closer. "And now, I'd rather build something here than take over what someone else left behind. She reached for his hand, cautious but certain. Then stay. He looked down at their joined fingers. I hadn't planned to leave, but it's good to know I'm wanted. She let her thumb rest against his. You are. The next morning, Susanna woke to the scent of fresh bread and the sound of Daisy laughing outside. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Micah was kneeling in the grass, holding a carved wooden horse while he reached for it with both hands. Daisy was trotting around them, pretending to be a wild Mustang. Susanna watched them for a long moment, heart caught between disbelief and something more tender. Micah looked up and caught her gaze. I made it from the scrap cedar, she nodded, voice caught in her throat. That evening, after the children had gone to bed and the sky was streaked with the last of the gold light, Susanna stood by the shed. Micah joined her, wiping his hands on a cloth. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. You could move the forge into the shed if you wanted, set up a bench. A grindstone. He looked at her, a stillness settling into his face. You sure? I wouldn't offer if I wasn't. He stepped forward, brushing a curl from her cheek. You'd have me that close? I already do, she said. Micah kissed her, then slow, certain, no hesitation in the way his hands framed her face. She leaned into him, the scent of cedar and smoke anchoring her in a way she hadn't felt in years. When they parted, the world was quiet again, but not empty. Not anymore. She rested her forehead against his. Stay the night, he searched her face. And the next, all of them, she whispered. Micah exhaled, the sound rough with something like relief. Then I will. Susanna stood in the shed doorway, arms folded, watching Micah hoist the forge bellows into place. He'd already set the anvil, square and solid, on a stump he'd leveled himself. The air held that damp scent of spring nearing full-bloom mud, budding branches, and the faint tang of iron from the tools he'd unpacked. You always work quiet, she said. Micah didn't glance up. Noise wastes breath. She stepped inside, brushing her fingers along a coil of horseshoe blanks hanging from a hook. You ever teach anyone this trade? He paused, then straightened. Once, boy out of Abilene didn't take to it. What happened? Joined a cattle drive. Got himself gored in Kansas, didn't last the year. Susanna leaned against the wall, her voice low. You carry all of them with you, don't you? Micah nodded once, slow. Some names never leave. She didn't press. Instead, she walked to the workbench and lifted a small hammer, feeling the weight of it in her palm. Daisy wants a garden box, she said, something she can plant her own seeds in. I can build that, he said. Let her pick the shape, she said, a heart. Micah gave that a moment's thought. Then I'll make the corners curve and soft. That evening, with the children tucked under quilts upstairs and the lanterns snuffed low, Susanna sat beside the hearth embroidering a new hem on Ellie's shirt. Micah's chair was drawn close, his hands resting idle on his knees. I had a brother, he said, voice quiet. Younger, stayed behind in Tennessee. He wanted to farm the old land, thought we could fix it after the war. What happened to him? He wouldn't leave when the wrong men came through. They burned the field, took the mule. Left him barely breathing. Susanna set her needle down. Micah, he lived, Micah said, but nothing of him stayed. He don't speak much anymore. I send coin when I can, but he won't come west. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. You never told me that, he met her gaze. Didn't know if I should, but I don't want to hold pieces back anymore. She let the silence settle before she spoke. I used to count the days Jacob stayed sober. Think maybe if I loved him better, he'd stop running from whatever chased him. Micah didn't move, but she felt the shift in him. I know now it wasn't about me, she said, but it still felt like I failed. You didn't fail, he said. You stayed, you raised them. You kept the roof whole. She pulled her knees up, resting her chin there. I don't want my children to grow up waiting for someone to come home who never meant to stay. They won't, Micah said, not so long as I'm here. The fire cracked, a slow, steady warmth filling the room. I never had someone say that to me, she said. Micah's thumb brushed over hers. Then let me be the first. Morning light came soft through the window panes the next day, casting long gold slants across the floorboards. Daisy was already outside, clutching a makeshift trowel, her apron tied uneven. Ellie sat at the table, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth as he drew wobbly horses on scrap paper. Susanna poured chicory into 2 tin mugs and carried one out to the porch. Micah was sanding the edges of the garden box, the cedar boards already cut to shape. He looked up as she stepped down, his eyes catching hers. "She's pacing like a marshal waiting on a prisoner," he said. "She's never had something all her own." Micah set the sandpaper aside. "Then it has to be good." "I think it already is." He reached for the mug she offered and took a long sip. "You think she'd mind if her name was carved along the side?" She'd wear out her voice telling folks about it. He smiled, the kind that didn't rush to fade. That night, as stars blinked out across the sky and the wind died to stillness, Susanna stood barefoot in the grass, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Micah came up behind her, his steps easy, unhurried. "You out here to listen?" he asked. She nodded. "Spring's coming on." "I can hear it." Micah looked toward the hills. "There'll be creek trout soon. I could teach him to cast." He'd like that. They stood together without speaking for a while, the night settling soft around them. Then Susanna turned, her voice steady. "Are you building the forge to stay or just to help?" Micah didn't hesitate. "To stay." She stepped in close, her hands resting against his chest. "Then I want you in the house." He blinked once, but his voice was sure. "You certain?" "I've never been more." He leaned down, his lips brushing her brow. "Then I'm yours." She pressed her forehead to his chest, breathing in the scent of wood ash and earth. The wind shifted, carrying the first promise of blooming things. And in that moment, the weight of every hard year lifted just enough to let something new take root. The last frost came and went in silence, leaving the fields pliable and damp beneath the heel. On a morning veiled in low cloud, Micah hitched the mare to the plow and worked the earth in long, deliberate rows, while Susanna stood at the edge of the field with Lily balanced on her hip, Daisy clinging to her skirt. The children watched wide-eyed as the soil curled up in rich, dark waves behind the blade. "Will it grow fast?" Daisy asked. "It'll grow honest," Susanna said. "That's better." Micah glanced up, sweat already darkening his collar, and gave a short nod before guiding the mare into the next row. His movements were steady, shaped by years of labor. Not hurried, not proud, just sure. That afternoon, Susanna found him behind the barn, kneeling beside the wheelbarrow with a cracked axle. He was humming something under his breath, tuneless and low. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I've been thinking about the ledger," she said. He sat back on his heels. "You keep one?" Jacob did, when he remembered to. "I've started fresh. We've got enough seed for the first 2 plantings, but we'll need to trade for flour and sugar before summer." Micah wiped his hands on a rag. "I can ride into San Luis next week, take a few horseshoes and some hinges to the mercantile. They'll trade fair." "I'd like to come with you." His brow lifted slightly. "What about the children?" Mrs. Allridge offered to watch them, her sons near Daisy's age. "They'd be glad for the company." Micah studied her for a long moment, then stood. "All right, we'll go together." The ride into town took half a day, the wagon creaking beneath them as they passed stands of cottonwood just beginning to leaf. Susanna had worn her second-best dress, the one with the blue hem she'd let down twice since last spring. She kept her hands folded in her lap, but every so often she glanced sideways at Micah. His jaw was set like always, but his eyes softened when he caught her looking. In San Luis, the wind swept dust around the storefronts, and the clapboard chapel bell rang once for the hour. Micah traded hand-forged goods at the general store while Susanna bartered for bolts of muslin. As they stepped out into the street, she turned to him. "You never mention what you want." He looked over, brow creasing. "Not for the land or the forge," she continued. "For yourself." Micah shifted his weight, adjusting the sack on his shoulder. "I haven't thought much that way." "You should." He fell quiet, then said, "All right. I want to build a smokehouse by fall. I want to fix the west fence before the elk come down, and I want to marry you." Susanna stopped walking. Micah turned back, voice low. "I mean it." She stared at him, this hard-handed man who had once kept to the edges, and felt every bone in her body go still. "I don't need a preacher," she said. "I know. I don't need papers," he nodded, "but I want vows, something said out loud in the open." Micah stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Then I'll speak them every day," he said. "If that's what you need." They returned home late with the stars just beginning to prick the sky. Mrs. Ulrich waved from her porch as they passed, children asleep on her parlor floor. Micah carried Daisy and Ellie to bed, pausing to tuck the quilt beneath their chins. Susanna watched him from the doorway, her heart full in a way it never had been before. Outside, the moon hung low, casting a soft light over the shed, the barn, the newly turned field. She stepped out into it and waited. Micah joined her, arms folded. "This land is yours now as much as mine," she said. He looked at her, the night quiet between them. "I want to stand beside you," she said. "Not just when it's easy," he nodded. "Then say the words with me." They stood in the wide stillness of their yard, nothing but the wind in the cottonwoods to bear witness. "I vow to build a life with you," she said, voice steady. "I vow to protect it," he answered. "I vow to keep truth between us. I vow to hold you at your strongest and your weakest. I vow to stay." Micah reached for her hand. "Then we're wed in all the ways that matter." She leaned in, forehead to his. "We are." By summer, the garden rose in full bloom, rows of beans, squash, and corn knee-high and climbing. The forge rang out in the mornings, and the scent of cedar smoke mixed with the sweet clover that grew wild at the fence line. Micah carved a second heart box for Ellie, smaller and square at the edges. Daisy planted marigolds in hers, proud and careful. Neighbors came to trade and stayed for supper. Laughter returned to the house, not loud but steady. On the night of the first harvest, Susanna stood barefoot in the field, watching the sun melt behind the hills. Micah joined her, his hand resting low at her back. "Do you miss the stillness from before?" she asked. He shook his head. "This is better." She looked up at him, face lit with the last of the day. "You ever think we'd have this?" "No," he said, "but I'm grateful every day we do." She leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "Then let's keep building," and they did. Through each season that followed, they planted, repaired, raised, and rebuilt. The children grew into the land as sure as the roots beneath it. Micah taught Ellie to temper iron, Susanna taught Daisy to preserve berries. They added a single-room addition to the house before the second winter, where the morning light fell just right on the floorboards. The forge stayed lit. The fields stayed full. And love, quiet and steady, never left them again.